At exactly 10:47 p.m., Diane Carter stood behind Whitmore Kitchens with a still warm bread box pressed against her chest. She wasn't grabbing everything from the dumpster. She quietly checked every expiration label, setting spoiled food aside and keeping only what was still safe enough to feed her 9-year-old son. When the restaurant manager stormed outside, accusing her of stealing garbage, Diane gently placed the bread back where she had found it. Then, before walking away, she stopped to gather the trash bags that had spilled onto the pavement. A man in a plain, dark coat had been watching the entire scene. Instead of calling security, he opened the back door and spoke softly. "Ma'am, would you come inside instead? Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what your local time is right now. And if stories about quiet courage and unexpected kindness mean something to you, consider subscribing so we can share many more together." The apartment was barely 600 square feet, tucked into the third floor of an aging brick building on the south side of Chicago. The windows rattled whenever the elevated train passed 2 blocks away, and the kitchen sink dripped with such stubborn rhythm that Diane Carter no longer noticed it. At 5:15 every morning, before the first hint of daylight reached the cracked blinds, she woke to the soft buzz of an old alarm clock that had belonged to her late husband. She never hit the snooze button. Discipline had become cheaper than comfort. She quietly slipped out of bed, careful not to wake 9-year-old Caleb sleeping in the next room. His bedroom was hardly bigger than a walk-in closet, but Diane had painted one wall blue with leftover paint from a community volunteer project. Above his bed hung dozens of hand-drawn paper stars. Every birthday, instead of expensive decorations, she helped him cut out another star and tape it to the wall. "There should always be something to look up at," she used to tell him. The coffee maker had stopped working months ago, so she heated water in a small, dented kettle. Breakfast was simple oatmeal measured carefully into 2 bowls. Caleb's portion always contained sliced bananas whenever she could afford them. Diane's rarely did. She smiled every morning as though she had already eaten. Caleb knew better. "You forgot your banana again," he said one Tuesday, pushing 2 slices into her bowl. "I like oatmeal plain." "You don't," she laughed softly. "When did you become smarter than your mother?" "When Dad said I should pay attention." The words lingered in the kitchen longer than either of them expected. Marcus Carter had been gone for 3 years. He had worked construction on high-rise buildings across Chicago, often leaving before sunrise, with his orange safety vest folded neatly over his arm. One rainy afternoon, faulty scaffolding collapsed 6 stories above the ground. Diane received the phone call while chopping onions during a lunch shift at a neighborhood diner. Everything after that seemed to happen underwater. The funeral, the insurance paperwork, the unpaid medical bills, the landlord waiting exactly 1 week before reminding her that rent was still due. People often said, "If you need anything, let us know." Most disappeared before she had the chance. By the time the sympathy cards stopped arriving, reality had settled in like a permanent winter. Diane sold Marcus's pickup truck first, then his collection of vintage tools, then her grandmother's dining table. She refused to sell one thing: Marcus's old recipe notebook. Its leather cover was worn smooth, and between recipes were handwritten notes they had exchanged during their first years together. Some pages contained measurements, others contained little reminders. Taste before serving. Never waste good bread. Feed people with respect. Those words had become almost sacred. Years earlier, Diana had worked as an assistant cook in a family-owned restaurant, famous for homemade soups and fresh bread. She wasn't formally trained, but she learned quickly. She could tell when yeast was ready simply by its smell. She knew exactly how long onions needed to caramelize without looking at a timer. Cooking had never been just work. It was the language through which she expressed care. When Marcus died, steady, restaurant jobs became impossible. Evening shifts clashed with childcare, and employers wanted flexible schedules she simply couldn't offer. One by one, Interviews ended with polite smiles and promises to call back. The phone rarely rang. Eventually, she pieced together 3 part-time jobs: cleaning offices before dawn, stocking shelves twice a week at a neighborhood pharmacy, washing dishes during weekend events whenever temporary agencies called. Some weeks she worked nearly 70 hours. Some weeks she barely earned enough to cover utilities. The hardest expense wasn't rent, it was Caleb's food. At age 6, Caleb had suffered a severe allergic reaction after accidentally eating food containing tree nuts. The ambulance ride alone nearly erased their savings. Since then, every grocery trip became an exercise in reading labels. Diane inspected ingredients with the concentration of a scientist. Artificial flavors, cross-contamination warnings, manufactured in facilities. Every sentence mattered. Safer foods almost always cost more. Sometimes she stood in supermarket aisles for 20 minutes comparing prices that differed by less than $1. $1 still mattered. On the refrigerator door hung a sheet of notebook paper divided into 7 columns. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. Every meal had been planned with astonishing precision. Chicken soup stretched into 2 dinners. Rice became fried rice the next day. Vegetable scraps flavored homemade broth. Nothing usable was thrown away. Not because Diane enjoyed living that way, because waste felt like a luxury. Every Friday evening she counted the remaining cash inside a faded blue envelope, marked simply, home. Rent, electricity, medicine, bus fare, each bill had its place. Whenever a few dollars remained, she slipped them into another envelope labeled Dream. Inside rested only $38. Caleb had once asked what the money was for. "A better stove someday," Diane answered. "Not a vacation." She smiled. "A stove can feed us for years." That answer somehow made perfect sense to him. Their neighbors often misunderstood Diane's quiet nature. Some assumed she was proud. Others believed she kept to herself because she didn't trust anyone. The truth was simpler. She hated asking for help. Not because she thought needing help was shameful, because she feared becoming someone people pitied more than they respected. Every evening after homework, Caleb sat at the tiny kitchen table, drawing imaginary restaurants. He gave them funny names like Captain Pancake and Rocket Spaghetti. "You'll cook," he would say. "And what will you do?" "I'll greet everyone." "You won't cook. I'll taste everything." She laughed harder than she had all day. Those small conversations carried them through evenings that otherwise might have felt unbearably heavy. Later that night, after Caleb fell asleep, Diane quietly opened Marcus's recipe notebook. A small bakery receipt slipped from between 2 pages. On the back, Marcus had scribbled something years ago after they shared a loaf they could barely afford. "One warm loaf can make a hard day feel smaller." She traced the faded handwriting with her fingertips. Then she looked toward the nearly empty bread box on the kitchen counter. Tomorrow's lunch would be difficult. The pantry contained half a bag of rice, 2 cans of tomatoes, 3 eggs, a few carrots already beginning to soften. She closed the notebook and whispered the same promise she had made every night since Marcus died. "We'll be okay." She wasn't certain whether she was speaking to herself, to Marcus, or to the quiet apartment around her. Outside, another train rumbled through the darkness. Inside, Diane set the empty bread box neatly beside the sink before turning off the kitchen light. She had no idea that less than 24 hours later, another bread box, still warm, rescued from behind one of Chicago's finest restaurants, would place her on the path toward a life neither she nor Caleb had ever imagined. Wednesday began with the sharp beep of Diane Carter's alarm at 4:45 a.m., 15 minutes earlier than usual. A supervisor from the downtown office building had texted the night before, asking if she could cover an extra cleaning shift. Diane accepted before even checking how many hours it would add to her day. Extra work almost always meant sacrificing sleep, but sleep never paid the electric bill. She slipped quietly through the apartment, pulling on faded sneakers whose soles had been glued twice already. Before leaving, she wrote a note for Caleb and placed it beside his cereal bowl. "Breakfast is in the fridge. Don't forget your science project. Love you." She added a tiny smiley face. Not because life felt cheerful, because Caleb smiled whenever he saw one. The city was still wrapped in darkness as Diane waited for the number 3 bus. Cold wind swept through the nearly empty stop, carrying the smell of wet pavement from rain that had fallen overnight. She rubbed her hands together inside thin gloves and mentally calculated the hours ahead. 3 hours cleaning offices, 4 hours stocking pharmacy shelves, maybe an evening dishwashing shift if the catering agency called. If she was lucky, today's earnings might reach $118 before taxes. Lucky. The word had changed meaning over the years. By 6:30 a.m., she was wiping fingerprints from conference room windows overlooking Chicago's skyline. Executives would arrive in polished shoes within an hour, never noticing that someone had emptied every trash can, disinfected every desk, and vacuumed every carpet before sunrise. Diane didn't resent them. Invisible work still mattered. She simply wished invisible workers mattered too. After finishing downtown, she hurried to the neighborhood pharmacy, arriving just before noon. Her manager, Denise, stood near the stockroom door, with an apologetic expression Diane had learned to recognize. "I'm really sorry," Denise said. "Corporate cut payroll again." Diane's stomach tightened. "What does that mean?" "I can only keep you for 2 hours today." "I was scheduled for 6. "I know." Denise lowered her voice. "They're reducing everyone's hours." Diane nodded slowly. There was nothing to argue. Denise wasn't the one making the decision. "It's okay," Diane said. Neither of them believed it. As she stocked allergy medication onto neatly organized shelves, Diane couldn't stop calculating. 4 hours lost. Almost $60 gone. $60 meant nearly a week's worth of groceries, or part of Caleb's next prescription refill, or the difference between paying the gas bill on time and receiving another warning notice. By the time her shortened shift ended, the blue envelope marked "Home" inside her purse suddenly felt much lighter. She walked 3 blocks before stopping outside a small grocery store. Inside, fluorescent lights reflected off polished floors, while soft music floated from hidden speakers. Diane picked up a shopping basket and moved carefully through each aisle. Rice, milk, eggs, bread. She paused in front of the bakery section. Fresh sandwich bread cost $4.89. Whole grain was nearly $6. She quietly placed the loaf back on the shelf. Instead, she bought a smaller discounted package that would barely last 2 days. At checkout, the total reached $27.61. Diane handed over $30 in carefully flattened bills. The cashier counted back the change. $2.39. Diane folded the coins into her wallet with deliberate care. Every coin still had work to do. Outside the grocery store, her phone buzzed. The catering agency. She answered immediately. "Hello? We're sorry, Diane. Tonight's event was canceled." "Is there anything else available?" A pause. "Nothing today." She thanked them anyway before ending the call. For several moments, she simply stood on the sidewalk as people flowed around her, each seemingly in a hurry toward someplace certain. She wasn't sure where certainty existed anymore. When she reached home, Caleb was sitting at the kitchen table building a cardboard model of the solar system. "Mom," he smiled, "guess what Mrs. Reynolds picked mine to display in the hallway?" "I knew she would." He noticed the smaller grocery bag. "No apples today?" "Not this time." "That's okay." He returned to painting Saturn with bright yellow rings. Children noticed far more than adults believed. That evening, they shared tomato rice with scrambled eggs. Caleb thanked his mother before every meal without being reminded. Marcus had started that tradition years ago. After dinner, Diane opened the refrigerator. 1 package of bread, half a gallon of milk, some vegetables. Not enough. She quietly closed the door before Caleb noticed her expression. Around 9 o'clock, after helping him finish homework and tucking him into bed, Diane sat alone at the kitchen table. The rent notice lay beside the utility bill. She counted the money again, then counted it a second time. The numbers refused to change. A memory drifted back unexpectedly. Months earlier, another woman working 2 jobs had quietly mentioned something while waiting for the bus. "If you're ever desperate," she'd whispered, almost embarrassed. "Some restaurants throw away perfectly good bread after closing. They can't sell it the next day." At the time, Diane had shaken her head. She had promised herself she would never reach that point. Tonight felt different, not because pride had disappeared, because Caleb needed lunch tomorrow. She looked at Marcus's old recipe notebook resting on the counter. 1 page described how stale bread could become soup, stuffing breadcrumbs, even breakfast casserole. Waste nothing. Respect every ingredient. The words echoed through the silent apartment. Diane took a deep breath. She wasn't planning to steal. She wasn't planning to trespass if she could avoid it. She simply remembered hearing that Whitmore Kitchens placed unopened bread and untouched produce into separate disposal bins behind the restaurant before sanitation pickup each night. If any food remained sealed and safe, maybe, just maybe. At 10:20 p.m., after making sure Caleb was asleep, Diane pulled on her gray jacket. She left a short note on the kitchen table. "Back soon." The city had grown quieter by the time she reached the alley behind Whitmore Kitchens. Warm light spilled from the kitchen windows while employees finished cleaning inside. She waited. 1 cook wheeled out several containers, another carried black trash bags. Then everyone disappeared indoors. Only after another 10 minutes did Diane step cautiously toward the designated food disposal containers. She lifted one lid. Inside were several unopened packages of dinner rolls, still sealed, still warm. Alongside them rested fresh lettuce tomatoes and vegetables removed from display because company policy required replacing them daily. She didn't touch anything immediately. Instead, she checked every expiration date one by one beneath the glow of a security light. 2 packages had torn plastic. She left them. 1 container of salad had expired. She set it aside. A loaf had become damp. She left it too. Finally, she found a sturdy cardboard bread box filled with individually wrapped artisan rolls baked only hours earlier. She held it gently, almost reverently. "Enough for sandwiches," she whispered. "Enough for Caleb." Just as she carefully placed the box into her reusable shopping bag, a harsh voice shattered the quiet night. "What do you think you're doing back there?" Diane froze. Slowly, she turned toward the bright beam of a flashlight. Curtis Malone was already striding across the loading area, anger written across his face. The flashlight beam settled directly on Diane Carter's face, forcing her to blink against the sudden glare. Curtis Malone crossed the loading dock with quick, heavy steps, his polished dress shoes clicking against the concrete. Behind him, the back door swung open again as 2 kitchen employees looked outside, curious about the raised voice. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Curtis demanded. Diane slowly lowered the reusable shopping bag onto the ground. "I'm sorry," she answered quietly. "I asked you a question." "I was taking food that had been thrown away." "You were stealing from private property." "No, sir." Her voice remained calm. "I only touched the food in the disposal containers." Curtis let out a sharp laugh. "You think that makes a difference?" Diane didn't answer immediately. She knew arguing rarely changed anyone's mind. Instead, she carefully removed the cardboard bread box from her bag and placed it back exactly where she had found it. "I don't want any trouble," One of the younger cooks folded his arms. If she's hungry, why doesn't she go to a shelter? Another shrugged. People always want something for free. Their words floated through the cold night air. Diane heard every one of them. She simply kept her eyes lowered. Curtis pointed toward the alley entrance. "Leave." "I'm leaving. And don't come back." She nodded. "I'm sorry." There was no bitterness in her voice, only exhaustion. As she turned to go, one of the large trash bags near the dumpster suddenly slipped from the edge of the container. It burst open as it hit the pavement, scattering plastic containers, paper cartons, and food scraps across the wet concrete. Nobody moved. Curtis looked at the mess with irritation. Unbelievable. Without saying a word, Diane quietly knelt. She began gathering the spilled garbage with her bare hands. A soggy napkin, plastic cups, cardboard trays. She tied the torn trash bag into a tighter knot before lifting the loose waste back inside. One cook stared at her. "You don't have to do that." Diane looked up briefly. "I know." She continued cleaning anyway. Less than a minute later, the loading dock looked exactly as it had before. She wiped her hands on an old cloth she carried in her jacket pocket. "I'm sorry for causing extra work." Curtis frowned, almost annoyed that she had removed one more reason to criticize her. Before he could speak again, another voice interrupted from the shadows. "Is everything all right here?" The tone was quiet, not loud, not commanding. Yet every employee instinctively turned. A man wearing a simple charcoal overcoat stepped into the light. He appeared to be in his late 50s, tall, with silver beginning to show at his temples. Nothing about his clothes suggested extraordinary wealth. If anything, he looked like an ordinary customer who had stayed late. Curtis immediately straightened. "Good evening, sir." The man nodded politely. "I heard shouting." Curtis forced a small smile. "Just handling a trespasser." The stranger's eyes moved toward Diane. She stood silently beside the dumpster, avoiding everyone's gaze. Then he looked at the neatly stacked food containers. Finally, he noticed something else. Each package Diane had left behind had been separated into two careful piles. One contained food no longer safe to eat. The other contained unopened items she had returned after being confronted. Nothing had been ripped open. Nothing damaged. Nothing hidden. He studied her for several seconds without speaking. Then he asked a simple question. "Were you planning to sell the food?" Diane looked surprised. "No, sir." "For yourself?" She hesitated. "My son." The answer was almost a whisper. "How old is he?" 9. The man nodded slowly. Another brief silence settled over the loading dock. Curtis stepped forward. "Sir, we should probably call security. Company policy." The stranger lifted one hand. Curtis stopped talking immediately. The man walked closer to the dumpster. Instead of looking at Diane, he examined the bread box she had returned. He touched it lightly. Still warm, freshly baked, only a few hours old. His expression changed almost imperceptibly. Memories flickered across his face. A small neighborhood bakery, cold winters, his own mother cutting stale bread into soup because nothing edible could ever be wasted. He blinked the memory away before anyone noticed. Then he looked back at Diane. "You checked every expiration date?" It wasn't a question. She nodded. "Some packages weren't safe anymore, so you left them?" "Yes." "You put the bread back after he confronted you?" Another nod. "I shouldn't have taken it once he asked me not to." Curtis crossed his arms. "She's saying whatever sounds good." The stranger ignored him. Instead, he noticed Diane's hands. The fingertips were red from detergent. Small cuts marked her knuckles. Tiny burns dotted 2 fingers. Kitchen burns, Not recent, old ones, repeated over years. Have you worked in restaurants before? He asked. Diane finally met his eyes. For several years. As what? Prep cook. Then, assistant cook. Why did you leave? My husband passed away. She didn't elaborate. She didn't ask for sympathy. She simply answered the question. The stranger glanced towards the kitchen windows glowing behind them. Inside, employees continued scrubbing counters and stacking chairs. Outside stood a woman who had just apologized for cleaning up someone else's garbage. Most people, he thought, reveal themselves when they believe no one important is watching. Tonight, Diane Carter had believed no one would ever know she had sorted unsafe food away from safe food. She had done it anyway. She had believed no one would thank her for cleaning spilled trash. She had done it anyway. Character rarely announced itself. It appeared quietly. Curtis cleared his throat. If we're finished here, I'll escort her off the property. The stranger turned toward him. No? The single word carried surprising weight. Curtis blinked. No, sir. The man took one final look at Diane. She seemed ready to leave without another sentence. No pleading, no excuses, no anger. Just dignity held together by sheer determination. He reached for the back door and opened it himself. Warm light spilled across the cold pavement. The aroma of fresh bread drifted outside. He stepped aside. His voice remained gentle enough that only those nearby could hear. Ma'am, Diane looked up. Would you come inside instead? Every employee on the loading dock froze. Curtis stared in disbelief. The younger cooks exchanged confused glances. No one understood why a complete stranger had just invited a woman caught searching through discarded food into one of Chicago's finest restaurants. Diane herself couldn't find the words. For a long moment she simply stood there, her hands trembling slightly from the cold, wondering whether stepping through that doorway would become the greatest mistake of her life, or the first good thing that had happened in years. For several seconds, Diane Carter didn't move. She had spent the last 3 years learning that unexpected kindness usually came with hidden conditions. Every promise deserved caution. Every invitation required careful thought. The warm light pouring from the open kitchen door felt almost unreal against the cold Chicago night. She looked at the stranger. I'm not in trouble. His expression softened. No. Then, why are you inviting me inside? Because it's warmer in there. The answer was so simple that it caught her off guard. Curtis Malone took an impatient step forward. Sir, with all due respect, employees are still cleaning. This isn't appropriate. The man turned toward him. Is the dining room closed? Yes. Is the kitchen still operating? Only for cleanup. Then preparing one more meal won't hurt anyone. Curtis pressed his lips together. Of course. Diane hesitated again. I don't have any money. I didn't ask you to pay. I can't accept charity. The stranger smiled faintly. Good. She frowned, confused. I wasn't offering charity. He stepped aside once more, leaving the doorway open. I was inviting you to dinner. After a long breath, Diane quietly nodded and followed him inside. The warmth hit her immediately. The scent of roasted garlic, fresh herbs, butter, and baked bread filled the air. Stainless steel counters reflected the bright ceiling lights. The kitchen was almost spotless despite the final cleanup underway. Several employees stopped what they were doing to watch. Some whispered. Others pretended not to stare. Diane suddenly became aware of the faded sleeves on her jacket and the damp cuffs of her jeans. She resisted the urge to apologize for simply existing. The stranger led her to a small wooden table near the corner of the kitchen rather than the elegant dining room. Please sit. She carefully lowered herself into the chair. He pulled out the opposite chair but remained standing. Would you like coffee? No, thank you. Tea? I'm fine. You've had a long day. She looked surprised. How did you know? He glanced at her hands. The cleaning chemicals dried your skin. Then toward her shoes. Your soles are worn unevenly. Finally, he noticed the reflective strip still stitched onto her work jacket. You've been on your feet since before sunrise. Diane gave a tired smile. I guess it's obvious. Only if someone is paying attention. One of the line cooks approached. What should I make? The stranger looked toward Diane. What sounds good? She almost laughed. I haven't been asked that in years. Then tonight seems like a good night to start. She looked down at the table for a moment. Soup. The cook waited. And fresh bread. The stranger nodded. Tomato basil soup. Yes, sir. Make 2 bowls. The cook blinked. 2. The stranger smiled. 1 for me. A few employees exchanged puzzled looks. Managers rarely sat down with strangers. Strangers who had just been found behind the dumpster even less. While the soup simmered, silence settled between them. It wasn't uncomfortable. It simply waited. Finally, the man extended his hand. I'm Ben. Diane? No last names tonight. She accepted the handshake. His grip was firm but unpretentious. You said you worked in restaurants. I did. What kind? A neighborhood place called Eleanor's Kitchen. I've heard of it. It closed during the pandemic. She nodded. The owner's retired. What did you do there? A little of everything. He smiled. That's every cook's answer. She laughed quietly. It's true. I made stocks. Prepared vegetables. Baked bread. Covered breakfast when someone called in sick. And learned from anyone willing to teach me. Ben leaned back slightly. Who taught you the most? My grandmother. What was her specialty? Making people feel full without making them feel poor. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he watched her face. She hadn't said the sentence dramatically. She had simply described someone she loved. A young server placed 2 steaming bowls on the table. Beside each bowl rested a thick slice of crusty artisan bread. The aroma alone made Diane's stomach tighten. She realized she hadn't eaten since 6 that morning. Please, Ben said. She hesitated, then picked up the spoon. The first taste nearly brought tears to her eyes. Not because it was extraordinary, because it was hot, fresh, made with care. For several quiet minutes, neither of them spoke. Across the kitchen, Gloria Hayes observed from her workstation while drying copper pans. She had spent 34 years around cooks. People revealed themselves by how they ate. Some rushed, some complained, some ignored the work behind the meal. Diane did none of those things. She tore the bread into small pieces instead of biting into it immediately. She tasted the soup before adding pepper. She closed her eyes briefly after the second spoonful, appreciating the balance of acidity and herbs. Professional habits. Gloria smiled to herself. Interesting. Ben noticed it too. So, he asked casually, what would you change? Diane nearly choked on her soup. I'm sorry. If you were cooking this. She stared at the bowl. You really want my opinion? I asked. She looked almost embarrassed. The tomatoes were roasted. They were. I'd finish with just a little lemon zest. Ben raised an eyebrow. Not more salt. She shook her head. The salt is already right. The soup only needs a brighter finish. Gloria stopped polishing the pan. She walked over slowly. You taste lemon? Diane nodded. It would lift the basil. Gloria picked up a clean spoon, tasted the soup herself, then looked toward Ben. She's right. The older chef reached into a nearby refrigerator, grated a little fresh lemon zest over the remaining soup in the pot, stirred gently, then tasted again. A slow smile spread across her face. "Well," she admitted, "I wish I'd thought of that." Several cooks gathered curiously. One by one, they sampled the adjusted soup. The difference was subtle, yet unmistakable. Brighter, warmer, more complete. Curtis, who had been watching from the office doorway with folded arms, looked increasingly uncomfortable. "It was fine before," Gloria glanced at him. "Fine isn't the same as memorable." Ben looked back at Diane. "You noticed that after one spoonful," she shrugged modestly. "I've made thousands of gallons of soup." "Really?" She smiled. "I lost count years ago." For the first time that evening, Ben saw something replace the exhaustion in her eyes. Confidence, not arrogance. The quiet confidence of someone who had spent years mastering a craft no one had asked about in a very long time. He realized something important. The woman everyone had seen standing behind a dumpster wasn't simply hungry. She was a skilled cook whose life had slowly narrowed until survival left no room for talent. Across the room, Gloria continued watching Diane with growing curiosity. Very few people could identify a missing ingredient after a single taste. Even fewer could do it without trying to impress anyone. Gloria walked closer, folded her arms gently, and asked the question that would quietly change the direction of the entire night. "Diane, when was the last time you actually cooked in a professional kitchen?" Diane Carter looked from Gloria Hayes to the steaming bowl in front of her. The question seemed simple, yet it carried the weight of every year she had spent away from the profession she once loved. She thought for a moment before answering. 3 years. The kitchen grew noticeably quieter. Gloria tilted her head. "That long?" Diane nodded. "My husband passed away. After that, I had to take whatever jobs fit around my son's schedule." Nobody spoke. In restaurants, 3 years could feel like a lifetime. Menus changed, equipment evolved, trends came and went. Skills, however, had a way of waiting. Gloria rested both hands on the stainless steel counter. "Would you mind proving something?" Diane looked surprised. "Proving what?" "Whether those 3 years took your hands away?" Before Diane could answer, Curtis Malone stepped forward. "Gloria, this is ridiculous." She didn't even look at him. "I'm asking a question." Curtis turned toward Ben. "We're not seriously letting someone we found behind the dumpster cook in our kitchen." Ben calmly folded his arms. "What exactly concerns you?" "Health regulations." "She hasn't touched anything." "Liability." "Then supervise." Curtis opened his mouth again before realizing Ben's tone had quietly ended the discussion. Gloria smiled faintly. "There." She pointed toward an empty prep station. "No pressure. No audience. Just cook something." Diane instinctively shook her head. "I don't want to cause trouble." "You aren't." "I don't even know where anything is." Gloria walked beside her. "I'll tell you." Diane slowly stood. The familiar smell of onions, butter, fresh herbs, and hot steel surrounded her. For the first time in years, she found herself standing in a professional kitchen instead of cleaning one. Her fingertips brushed the edge of the cutting board. It felt strangely like coming home. Gloria opened a refrigerator. "You may use anything that's already prepped." Diane looked inside. Chicken stock, fresh vegetables, heavy cream, roasted tomatoes, herbs, parmesan, fresh bread. She smiled, almost unconsciously. "What are you thinking?" Gloria asked. Diane answered without hesitation. "A roasted vegetable soup." "That's ambitious." "It's also forgiving." Ben watched quietly from several feet away. He wasn't studying her recipe. He was studying her movements. Diane washed her hands carefully, longer than required. She dried them completely before touching a knife. She inspected the blade first. Not because she doubted it, because every professional cook checked their tools before beginning. Then she started. There was no rush, no dramatic flourishes. Every movement appeared economical. Onions were diced into nearly identical cubes, carrots matched them, celery followed. The knife never slammed against the board. It simply moved with quiet confidence. One young line cook whispered to another, "She cuts faster than Rick." Gloria heard him. "So does half this kitchen." A few people laughed softly. Even Curtis couldn't deny what everyone was seeing. This woman wasn't pretending. She belonged behind the counter. Diane warmed olive oil before adding vegetables. No sizzling explosion, just a gentle sound. She waited, then stirred. She didn't keep moving them constantly. She allowed them to soften naturally. Gloria smiled. Patience. Ben looked toward her. What? Most inexperienced cooks stir too much. They're afraid. She isn't. After several minutes, Diane added garlic. Only then, not earlier. Not later. The aroma spread instantly through the kitchen. Several employees looked up. One dishwasher actually paused in the middle of stacking plates. "What smells so good?" Nobody answered. Everyone already knew. Diane poured in roasted tomatoes, then the stock. She adjusted the flame almost instinctively. Not once did she ask where to find ingredients. Professional kitchens she knew always followed similar logic. The details changed. The rhythm didn't. While the soup simmered, Gloria casually walked beside her. "Who taught you knife work?" "My grandmother started." "And after that?" "Chef Luis Mendoza." Gloria's eyebrows lifted. "The Luis Mendoza? The one who owned Eleanor's kitchen. I staged there once." Diane looked genuinely surprised. "You did? 20 years ago." They exchanged the first real smile of the evening. Two cooks speaking the same language. Meanwhile, Ben wandered toward the bread station. Fresh artisan loaves waited to be sliced for tomorrow's service. His fingers rested lightly on one still wrapped in linen, warm, exactly like the bread box Diane had found outside. Without warning, another memory surfaced. He was 8 years old again. Snow covered the sidewalks. His mother stood outside a neighborhood bakery just before closing. The owner handed her a paper bag. "These can't be sold tomorrow." She accepted it with both hands. Not because it was free, because she understood the baker wasn't giving away leftovers. He was honoring the work that had gone into making them. That night she had broken the bread carefully at their tiny kitchen table. Then she looked at young Ben and smiled. Never forget. Food carries dignity before it carries flavor. He hadn't heard those words in decades. Until tonight. Until Diane had carefully sorted safe food from unsafe food behind the dumpster. She hadn't been searching for scraps. She had been protecting dignity. Back at the stove, Diane tasted the soup. She reached for pepper, then stopped. Instead, she picked up fresh thyme. Gloria noticed. "Changing your mind? The tomatoes are sweeter than I expected." "So, it needs earthiness, not spice." Gloria nodded approvingly. The adjustment was almost invisible, but everyone in the kitchen could smell the difference moments later. The soup felt deeper, warmer, balanced. Curtis shifted uneasily. He hated that the staff had begun drifting toward Diane's station. No one had been told to watch. They simply wanted to. When the soup was ready, Gloria filled 4 small tasting bowls. One for herself, one for Ben, one for the sous chef, one for Curtis. Curtis frowned. "I don't need... Taste it." He reluctantly accepted the bowl. The 4 tasted together. Silence. Ben lowered his spoon first. "This is excellent." The sous chef nodded immediately. "I'd serve this tonight." Gloria looked directly at Diane. "What did you do differently?" Diane hesitated. "I respected the vegetables." Several cooks chuckled softly. Gloria didn't. "What do you mean?" "They were already good. I didn't need to hide them. The older chef smiled slowly. That's exactly right. Curtis cleared his throat. It's still only soup. No, Gloria replied calmly. It's judgment. She turned toward Ben. You can teach recipes. You can teach procedures. You can even teach speed. But judgment, she looked back at Diane. That takes years. Ben said nothing. He simply continued watching Diane clean her own station before anyone asked. She wiped every surface, returned every knife, organized every ingredient she had used. Then she thanked Gloria for letting her cook. No one had reminded her to clean. No one had inspected her work. She simply believed a kitchen should be left better than she found it. Ben suddenly understood why something had bothered him all evening. Everyone outside had been focused on the woman searching through a dumpster. No one had asked why someone with this level of skill had ended up there in the first place. He looked toward Diane. What if, he said quietly, the problem was never your ability to cook? She looked at him, puzzled. Ben continued. What if the problem was that no one had bothered to look closely enough? The question lingered in the warm kitchen air. And before Diane could answer, Ben made a decision that would surprise everyone in the room, including Diane herself. No one spoke after Ben Whitmore's question. The silence wasn't awkward. It was thoughtful, as if everyone in the kitchen had suddenly been forced to reconsider the story they had written about Diane Carter in their minds only an hour earlier. Diane lowered her eyes. I've asked myself that question, she admitted, more times than I can count. Ben leaned against the prep table. What answer did you find? She let out a quiet breath. Life doesn't always stop because you're good at something. Her words settled heavily over the room. When Marcus died, she continued, I couldn't work dinner shifts anymore. Restaurants need people on weekends, holidays, nights. Exactly when my son needed me most. Gloria nodded slowly. She knew the industry well enough to understand. I went to interviews, Diane said. Managers liked my experience until they heard I needed one fixed schedule. After that, she smiled without bitterness. Someone else was always more flexible. You never lied, one of the younger cooks asked. Diane looked at him. About what? Your availability. She shook her head. If I lied to get hired, I'd only disappoint them later. Ben noticed something remarkable. She spoke about rejection without accusing anyone. She simply described facts. That kind of honesty was becoming rare. Curtis finally broke the silence. With respect, being talented doesn't automatically qualify someone for employment. No, Ben agreed. It doesn't. Curtis looked relieved for a brief second. Ben continued, but refusing to see talent because of first impressions disqualifies leaders. The sentence landed like a stone. Several employees quietly returned to their work, pretending not to listen while hearing every word. Ben turned back to Diane. You said your son is 9. Yes. Who's with him now? He was asleep when I left. You left him alone? The question wasn't judgmental. It was concerned. Diane answered honestly. For about an hour? She checked the old watch on her wrist. It has been longer than I planned. A flicker of worry crossed her face. I should go. She reached for her jacket. Thank you for the meal. And for letting me cook. Before she could put on the coat, Ben spoke again. Wait, she paused. I'd like to ask you something. She stood quietly. If the answer is no, that's perfectly acceptable. Diane nodded. All right. What if you came back tomorrow morning? She looked confused. As a customer. As a candidate. The room became still. Curtis stared at Ben as though he had misheard him. A candidate, Ben nodded. I'd like you to complete a formal 3-day kitchen evaluation. Curtis stepped forward immediately. Sir, our hiring process doesn't work that way. It does now. We have applications. She'll complete one. Background checks. We'll run one. Interviews. Ben smiled. I'm interviewing her. Curtis struggled to hide his frustration. People are going to ask questions. They should. Gloria crossed her arms. I have one. Ben looked toward her. Go ahead. Is this because you feel sorry for her? The question surprised everyone, including Diane. Ben answered without hesitation. No. Gloria waited. If it were pity, Ben continued, I'd hand her an envelope of cash and send her home. He looked directly at Diane. That would solve my discomfort. Then he slowly shook his head. It wouldn't solve her future. Diane felt something tighten in her throat. No one had ever explained the difference so clearly. Ben continued. I don't hire people because they need jobs. I hire people because they solve problems. He gestured toward the empty soup bowls. Tonight she solved one. Gloria smiled. So you noticed? I noticed several. He began counting on his fingers. She respected food. She respected the kitchen. She cleaned without being asked. She corrected a recipe without embarrassing anyone. And she thanked every employee who helped her. He looked around the room. Those things can't be taught in orientation. Curtis folded his arms tightly. What position are you offering? Ben answered carefully. None. Everyone looked puzzled. I'm offering an opportunity. He turned toward Diane. You'll start exactly where every cook here started. A 3-day evaluation. No promises. No special treatment. If you pass, you'll earn your place. If you don't, he shrugged gently. Then we'll shake hands, and I'll wish you well. Diane stared at him for several seconds. You mean that? I do. She swallowed. I don't want anyone thinking I received special treatment. Then don't give them a reason to. Another silence followed. Finally, Diane spoke. I accept. Her voice was steady. But I have one condition. Ben's eyebrows lifted. You have one. She nodded. If I fail, you'll know it was because of my cooking, not because someone felt sorry for me. Ben smiled. I wouldn't agree to anything else. Across the kitchen, Gloria quietly laughed. I like her. One of the younger cooks whispered to another, I think she's going to survive. Gloria overheard him. Survive? She smiled knowingly. I think some of you should be worried. A few nervous laughs spread through the kitchen. Even Diane laughed. It was the first genuine laugh she had shared with strangers in years. Ben glanced at the clock. It'll be nearly midnight before you get home. Diane's smile faded. Caleb. She immediately reached into her pocket for her phone. The battery had died hours earlier. She closed her eyes briefly. I need to leave. Ben nodded. Of course. He picked up one of the warm bread boxes from the prep counter. Diane instinctively stepped back. I can't. Why not? It belongs to the restaurant. It does. So I shouldn't take it. Ben walked toward Gloria. Chef? She looked up. Will this bread be served tomorrow? Gloria checked the label. No. It'll be replaced during the morning bake. What happens to it? We donate some. And the rest? She hesitated. It depends. Ben handed the bread box to Gloria. Would you prepare a staff meal package? Gloria immediately understood. She placed fresh soup into a sealed container, added the bread a few pieces of fruit, and wrapped everything neatly in a paper bag. Then she walked over and handed it to Diane. This isn't charity, Gloria smiled warmly. It's tomorrow's staff meal. Diane looked from Gloria to Ben, then back to the bag. This time she accepted it. Thank you. As she reached the door, Ben called after her one last time. Diane. She turned. Be here at 7 sharp. I will. And bring comfortable shoes. She looked down at her worn sneakers. I only have these. Ben smiled. Then bring those. She nodded before stepping into the cool Chicago night, holding the paper bag carefully against her chest. Behind her, the kitchen door closed softly. Curtis waited until Diane disappeared from view before speaking. You really believe she belongs here? Ben watched through the small window as Diane hurried toward the street, clutching the bag with one hand, while reaching into her purse with the other, no doubt searching for bus fare. No, Ben answered quietly. Curtis looked surprised. I believe she belongs much further than here. Diane Carter arrived at Whitmore Kitchens the next morning at exactly 6:42 a.m., 18 minutes before she had been asked to report. Old habits had taught her that being early was one of the few advantages a person without influence could control. Chicago was just beginning to wake. Delivery trucks backed into loading docks while the first streaks of orange sunlight reflected against downtown windows. The smell of fresh bread drifted from the bakery section long before the restaurant opened its doors. Diane paused outside for a moment. She looked down at her sneakers. The rubber around the toes had separated slightly, despite another careful layer of glue. They weren't ideal for a professional kitchen, but they were clean. She had scrubbed them by hand before sunrise until the white trim looked almost new. She straightened her borrowed apron inside her backpack and walked through the employee entrance. A young receptionist glanced up. You must be Diane? Yes, ma'am. Chef Gloria is expecting you. As Diane walked through the hallway, she noticed framed photographs lining the walls. Awards, grand openings, newspaper headlines celebrating Whitmore Kitchens as one of the country's fastest-growing restaurant groups. Near the end of the hallway hung a much older photograph. A tiny neighborhood restaurant. Only 6 employees stood outside the front door. Among them was a much younger Ben Whitmore wearing a flower-covered apron. Diane smiled. Everyone started somewhere. She found Gloria already organizing prep lists. Good morning. You beat me by 3 minutes, Gloria said with a grin. I like arriving early. I noticed. Gloria handed her a clean chef's jacket. The embroidered Whitmore Kitchens logo on the chest looked almost unreal to Diane. It's only for the evaluation, Gloria said. I understand. Diane carefully folded her own sweater and placed it inside a locker. For just a moment, she stood looking at herself in the stainless steel reflection. It had been years since she had worn a chef's jacket. She whispered quietly, Don't waste this. At precisely 7 o'clock, Curtis Malone entered the kitchen, carrying a clipboard. His expression revealed nothing. We'll begin. The evaluation wasn't announced to the entire staff, but word had traveled quickly. Several cooks glanced toward Diane before returning to their stations. Curtis began without greeting. Today's assignment is breakfast preparation. He placed a list in front of her. Vegetables for omelets. Fruit preparation. Soup stock. Inventory check. Cleaning rotation. Diane looked over the list. It wasn't impossible. It was the workload normally assigned to nearly 2 people. She looked up. Any questions? Curtis asked. No? Good. He walked away before she could say another word. One line cook leaned over. He always does this. Does what? Gives impossible schedules. Diane smiled politely. I'll do what I can. She tied her apron, washed her hands, and immediately began organizing the station before touching a single ingredient. Knife on the right. Cutting board secured with a damp towel underneath. Waste container within reach. Sanitizer cloth folded neatly beside the sink. Gloria watched from across the room. She didn't interrupt. Good cooks created order before creating food. Within minutes, Diane's station looked calmer than anyone else's. Then the work began. Her knife moved steadily through onions, peppers, mushrooms, and spinach. She wasn't the fastest cook in the kitchen. She didn't try to be. Every slice matched the last. Every container received a label. Every ingredient returned to refrigeration the moment she finished using it. At 8:15, breakfast orders began arriving. The kitchen erupted into organized chaos. 2 Denver omelets, 1 veggie scramble, hash browns working, pancakes on pickup. Voices overlapped continuously. Diane stayed focused on prep while quietly anticipating what each station would need next. Without being asked, she replenished chopped peppers before they ran out. She refilled spinach. She replaced empty herb containers. One cook looked over in surprise. "I was just about to ask." "You looked low," Diane replied. The morning rush intensified. Then the first problem appeared. A young prep cook named Tyler hurried past carrying a large container of whisked eggs. Someone shouted behind him. He turned his head for only a second. The container slipped. Egg mixture exploded across the floor. Several employees jumped backward. Curtis spun around immediately. "What happened?" "I'm sorry." Tyler's face turned pale. "We don't have time for this." Breakfast tickets continued printing. The floor had become dangerously slippery. Without hesitation, Diane stepped away from her station. She grabbed caution signs, placed them around the spill. Another employee fetched towels after seeing her move. Within seconds, Diane organized 3 people without raising her voice. "You mop." "I'll keep customers' food away from this area." "Someone bring fresh eggs." Tyler looked frozen. She touched his shoulder gently. "Wash your hands." "We'll fix it." The young man nodded and hurried away. Less than 4 minutes later, the station was operating again. Curtis looked annoyed. Not because the crisis had happened, because Diane had solved it naturally. Ben had entered quietly during the commotion. He stood near the office doorway, observing without announcing himself. Nobody noticed except Gloria. She walked over. "You picked an interesting morning?" "I didn't pick it." "What did you see?" Ben kept watching Diane. She never asked who was responsible. No, she asked what needed to happen next. Gloria smiled. "Exactly." Across the kitchen, Diane returned to chopping herbs as though nothing unusual had occurred. Tyler approached her a few minutes later. "I'm sorry." "For what?" "I ruined your schedule." She shook her head. "You had an accident." "I almost shut down breakfast." "You helped reopen it." He looked confused. "I did." "You cleaned the second spill before anyone asked." A small smile appeared on his face. Nobody had thanked him. Until now. The lunch prep period began immediately after breakfast. Curtis walked over carrying another clipboard. Without a word, he placed 2 additional assignments beside Diane. She glanced down. Fresh pasta preparation. Dessert garnish for afternoon service. The work already exceeded a normal shift. Several cooks exchanged uneasy looks. Even Gloria frowned. "That's excessive." Curtis answered calmly. "She's here to prove herself." Gloria replied, just as calmly. "Not to replace 3 employees." Curtis didn't respond. He simply walked away. Diane looked at the expanded list. For the first time all morning, she took a slow breath. The workload could still be finished, but only if everything went perfectly. At that exact moment, she reached into the refrigerator for a tray of fresh herbs. The tray wasn't there. Instead, she found an almost empty container with barely enough parsley for a single order. She looked around the kitchen. No backup, no replacement. Lunch service would begin in less than 45 minutes, and without fresh herbs, 3 signature dishes couldn't be completed according to recipe. Somewhere nearby, Curtis watched quietly, almost as if he had expected this exact moment to happen. Diane Carter closed the refrigerator door without letting frustration show on her face. She checked the inventory sheet again. According to the morning log, 3 full trays of fresh parsley should have been delivered before dawn. Instead, only a handful of wilted sprigs remained in a plastic container. Lunch service would begin in less than 40 minutes. Several signature dishes depended on fresh herbs. The easiest reaction would have been to panic. The second easiest would have been to blame someone else. Diane chose neither. She quietly walked to Gloria Hayes. "Chef." Gloria looked up from the prep station. "Yes." "The parsley delivery isn't here." Gloria frowned. "That can't be right." She opened the refrigerator herself. A moment later, her expression hardened. "It should have arrived at 6. Tyler hurried over with the receiving log. "I checked everything this morning." "The truck only delivered one produce pallet." Gloria scanned the paperwork. They missed an entire shipment. Curtis Malone appeared almost immediately. "What's the delay?" Gloria held up the paperwork. "Our herbs never arrived?" Curtis looked briefly into the refrigerator. "We'll manage." "How?" Gloria asked. Curtis shrugged. "Use dried parsley." Several cooks exchanged uneasy glances. Everyone knew that wasn't an acceptable substitute for Whitmore Kitchen's lunch menu. "It changes the dishes completely," Gloria replied. Curtis folded his arms. "Customers won't notice." "They will." "They won't." Before the conversation could continue, Diane spoke quietly. "What time is the next produce delivery from our supplier?" Curtis answered without looking at her. "Tomorrow." "So waiting isn't an option?" "No." She thought for several seconds. Then another memory surfaced. Years earlier, the owner of Eleanor's Kitchen had once told her something she never forgot. "A good kitchen doesn't survive because everything goes according to plan. It survives because someone stays calm when nothing does." Diane turned toward Gloria. "May I see today's menu?" Gloria handed it over. Diane read every lunch item carefully. Roasted chicken, herb-crusted salmon, house pasta, garden soup, seasonal vegetables. She mentally separated recipes into 2 groups, those that absolutely required parsley, those that could be adjusted without compromising quality. Then she looked toward a nearby storage shelf. Fresh basil, chives. Italian parsley wasn't the only fresh herb in the building. She turned back to Gloria. "I have an idea." Curtis sighed dramatically. "Of course you do." Diane ignored the comment. "The salmon needs brightness more than parsley." "Basil would overpower it," Gloria replied instinctively. "Not if it's blended with chives." Gloria paused. Diane continued. "The roasted chicken can be finished with herb butter instead of chopped garnish. The soup already contains parsley inside the stock. It doesn't need extra on top." "What about the pasta?" Gloria asked. "We make a gremolata using lemon zest, basil, and chives." Silence spread through the prep area. Several cooks looked at one another. Nobody spoke first. Finally, Gloria reached for a tasting spoon. "Let's test it." Within minutes, Diane prepared a tiny sample. No elaborate presentation, just one forkful. Gloria tasted. Then another bite. She looked toward Ben Whitmore, who had quietly entered the kitchen again during the discussion. "You should try this." Ben accepted the fork. He chewed slowly, then smiled. "It works." "It isn't identical," Diane admitted. "It doesn't need to be. It respects the dish." Gloria nodded. "Exactly." Curtis remained unconvinced. "You can't just rewrite recipes." Ben looked at him. "Great chefs adapt. They don't surrender." The kitchen immediately shifted into motion. Fresh basil was chopped, lemon zest prepared, butter softened. Instead of wasting time complaining about missing ingredients, everyone focused on solutions. The atmosphere changed. Tyler leaned toward Diane while chopping herbs. "How did you think of that so fast?" She smiled. "My grandmother." He laughed. "She sounds amazing." "She was." "What did she teach you?" Diane continued slicing basil into fine ribbons. "That recipes are important. But people are more important. if serving a good meal means adjusting with honesty. She shrugged, then adjust honestly. Tyler repeated the phrase quietly as though committing it to memory. Lunch service began exactly on schedule. Tickets poured from the printer. The kitchen accelerated into its familiar rhythm. Plates moved rapidly down the line. No one outside the kitchen knew there had nearly been an ingredient crisis. Customers simply enjoyed their meals. Near the dining room entrance, one server approached Gloria. "Table 12 wants to compliment the salmon." Another followed moments later. And Table 7 asked what herbs were used on today's pasta. Within 30 minutes, 3 separate guests praised the freshness of the revised dishes. Curtis listened without saying anything. His expression grew increasingly difficult to read. Around 2 o'clock, the lunch rush finally eased. Employees began wiping counters and restocking ingredients. Diane removed her apron for a brief water break. She hadn't realized she had been standing for nearly 7 straight hours. Ben walked over carrying 2 bottles of water. He handed one to her. "Thank you." "You earned it," she smiled. "I only solved today's problem." He looked around the busy kitchen. "Do you know what impressed me most? The recipes. No. The speed. No." She waited. "You never complained." Diane considered the question. "Complaining doesn't bring parsley." Ben laughed quietly. "No, it doesn't." A few feet away, Gloria watched the exchange with folded arms. She had supervised hundreds of cooks throughout her career. Many possessed remarkable technical ability. Some were extraordinarily creative. Very few naturally made everyone around them calmer. Diane did. Not by giving orders. By giving confidence. Later that afternoon, Gloria invited Diane into the small training kitchen used for new employee orientation. The room was simple compared to the main kitchen. 1 prep table, 2 refrigerators, a whiteboard, shelves lined with ingredients. Gloria closed the door behind them. "I've been thinking." Diane waited respectfully. "You've spent all day solving immediate problems." "I suppose." "But earlier this morning..." Gloria picked up a clipboard from the counter. "You also noticed something no one else mentioned." Diane looked puzzled. "What do you mean?" "When you organized your prep station. You counted waste containers. You adjusted refrigerator space. You labeled ingredients differently. I've never seen you work here before." "So why did you organize everything that way?" Diane answered almost automatically. "To reduce waste." Gloria narrowed her eyes. "What kind of waste?" "Time. Movement. Ingredients." She walked toward the whiteboard. "If stations are organized better..." She sketched a simple layout. "Cooks take fewer steps. They forget fewer items. They overproduce less food." She stopped suddenly. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to overstep." Gloria wasn't looking at the drawing anymore. She was looking directly at Diane. A slow smile spread across the veteran chef's face. "You've been here 1 day." "1 day. And you're already redesigning the kitchen." Before Diane could respond, Ben quietly entered the room. He had heard only the final sentence. His eyes moved from Gloria to the sketch on the whiteboard, then back to Diane. "What exactly are you redesigning?" Diane Carter instinctively stepped away from the whiteboard. "I wasn't redesigning anything," she said. "I was only explaining what I noticed." Ben Whitmore walked closer, studying the simple sketch. There were no complicated diagrams, just rectangles representing prep stations, arrows showing unnecessary movement, and a few handwritten notes in the margin. Gloria folded her arms. "She thinks our kitchen walks too much." Ben looked amused. "Our kitchen walks?" Gloria nodded. "Listen to her." Diane hesitated. "I don't want to criticize." "You aren't," Ben replied. "You're observing." She took a slow breath. When I worked at Eleanor's kitchen, Chef Mendoza used to say every unnecessary step steals time from the food. Ben nodded slightly. Go on? Diane pointed towards the drawing. The vegetable station is on the opposite side from the refrigerator that stores herbs. So every cook crosses the aisle dozens of times every shift. She moved her finger again. The compost bins are also too far away. People naturally throw more usable scraps into the trash because they're rushing. Gloria's eyes widened. I've complained about that for years, Diane continued. The clean containers are stored above shoulder height. That slows everyone down. And, she stopped. Ben smiled. And the bread. What about it? She glanced towards the bakery section. Fresh bread sits under the heat lamps longer than necessary. The crust dries faster. It isn't unsafe. It just isn't as good. Silence filled the room. None of these issues sounded dramatic. Individually, each one seemed insignificant. Together, they described hundreds of tiny inefficiencies repeated every single day. Ben looked at Gloria. Has anyone done this analysis before? She shook her head. Consultants have. And they measured labor costs. They measured ticket times. They measured profit. She looked toward Diane. No one measured the kitchen the way a cook would. Ben studied the sketch again. Interesting. At that moment, Curtis Malone entered the training kitchen carrying a folder. I've completed the afternoon reports. He stopped when he noticed everyone gathered around the whiteboard. What's going on? Ben answered calmly. We're discussing workflow. Curtis glanced briefly at Diane's drawing. I don't think our evaluation candidate is qualified to redesign a flagship restaurant. Diane immediately spoke. He's right. Everyone looked at her. I've only been here one day. I don't know everything. I was simply sharing ideas. Curtis looked almost satisfied. There. Ben, however, asked a different question. Diane. If you were wrong, she nodded. I'd want someone to explain why. And if you were right, she smiled politely, then everyone benefits. The answer lingered in the room. No defensiveness, no pride, only practicality. Ben turned to Curtis. Let's test one suggestion. Curtis frowned. Now. Why not? It's the middle of service. We'll use the training kitchen. Within minutes, Gloria and two cooks recreated one prep station exactly as Diane had drawn it. Herbs moved beside vegetables, containers lowered to waist height, waste bins repositioned. Nothing expensive, nothing permanent. Just organization. Ben checked his watch. Ready? Tyler volunteered first. What do you want me to prep? Salad vegetables. He completed the task using the original layout. Gloria timed him. Then he repeated the exact assignment using Diane's arrangement. When he finished, Gloria looked at the stopwatch. Huh. Ben raised an eyebrow. Difference. 48 seconds. Curtis shrugged. Less than a minute. Gloria looked directly at him. Her order. She performed quick mental calculations. Hundreds of orders? Hundreds of unnecessary trips. Thousands of extra steps every week. Curtis didn't answer. For the first time, the room wasn't debating Diane's talent. They were measuring it. Ben walked slowly toward the window, overlooking the main kitchen. Cooks moved quickly from station to station. Steam rose from stock pots. Servers carried plates into the dining room. He suddenly wondered how many talented people had quietly passed through his company without anyone asking what they noticed. His success had been built on listening. Somewhere along the way, meetings had replaced conversations. Reports had replaced observation. Spreadsheets had replaced people. Behind him, Gloria was still examining Diane's sketch. You've thought about this before. Diane nodded. Every kitchen I cleaned. You redesigned them in your head. I couldn't help it. Even while working janitorial jobs, she smiled. I love kitchens. They deserve to work well. Ben slowly turned around. You said something last night. Diane looked at him. What was it? You said your grandmother taught you to make people feel full without making them feel poor. She nodded. I remember. What else did she teach you? Diane thought quietly. Then she answered. She believed wasting food and wasting people came from the same habit. Ben frowned slightly. What habit? Looking only at what's obvious. She continued gently. If someone sees stale bread, they throw it away. If another person sees breadcrumbs, they make dinner. She paused. If someone sees a tired single mother behind a dumpster, they see a problem. She looked down at the sketch. If they look longer, they might see a cook. The room fell silent again. Gloria lowered the clipboard in her hands. Even Curtis avoided speaking. Ben recognized something unsettling. Those words weren't only about Diane, they were about him. He had built one of the largest restaurant companies in the Midwest by insisting that every ingredient deserved attention, yet somehow he had allowed an entire system to overlook people with the same carelessness. He walked toward the doorway. Gloria? Yes. How much food does this location discard every week? She answered cautiously. I'd have to check. Estimate. Several thousand pounds. Diane's eyes widened. So much, Gloria sighed. Some of it's unavoidable. But she didn't finish. Diane quietly looked through the window into the main kitchen. One cook scraped untouched roasted vegetables into a disposal container because fresh batches had already been prepared for dinner service. Another emptied an entire tray of dinner rolls. Perfectly edible, perfectly fresh, simply no longer scheduled to be served. She remembered the bread box from the night before. She remembered Caleb carefully splitting a banana in half because he wanted her to have some too. She remembered counting every dollar inside the blue envelope marked home. Thousands of pounds. The number echoed inside her mind. Not with anger, with possibility. She turned toward Ben. May I ask something? Of course. What happens to all that food? Ben answered honestly. Some is donated. And the rest. He hesitated. Most is discarded. Diane looked back through the window. I think... She stopped herself. Ben waited. I think the waste isn't only the food. What do you mean? She met his eyes. I think we're throwing away opportunities too. Ben said nothing, but for the first time since founding Whitmore Kitchens nearly 30 years earlier, he found himself wondering whether the biggest problem inside his company had never been hidden in accounting reports. Perhaps it had been sitting quietly behind every restaurant inside dumpsters no executive had bothered to truly look into. Ben Whitmore stood in silence long after everyone else had returned to work. Diane's final sentence echoed in his mind. I think we're throwing away opportunities too. Most executives would have heard an opinion. Ben heard a question he could no longer ignore. By the end of that afternoon, he asked his executive assistant to cancel every meeting scheduled for Friday. Instead of flying to New York for an investors' luncheon, he spent the day inside the Chicago flagship restaurant. Not in the dining room, in the kitchen. He watched vegetables being trimmed, bread being baked, soup simmering. He noticed things he hadn't paid attention to in years. A cook threw away bruised tomatoes that could have become sauce. Another discarded bread that was no longer beautiful enough for table service but was still perfectly edible. Everything complied with company policy. Everything looked efficient. Yet something felt deeply incomplete. Late that afternoon, Ben called Gloria Diane and the operations director into the training kitchen. A stack of reports sat on the table. I asked accounting to calculate our average weekly food waste. The operations director adjusted his glasses. Across the company? Just this location. He slid a report across the table. Approximately 3,100 pounds. Diane stared at the number. Every week, the director nodded. Some of it is unavoidable. Gloria quietly added, not all of it. Ben looked toward Diane. If you could change one thing first. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she opened the report and read every page. Finally, she spoke. I wouldn't start with the food. The director looked puzzled. What would you start with? Training? He frowned. Our staff already receives training. They receive operational training. She looked up. I'm talking about judgment. Nobody interrupted. Diane continued. Teach cooks the difference between unsafe food and unsellable food. They're not the same thing. She pointed to one section of the report. These dinner rolls. They weren't stale. They simply couldn't be sold the following day. She turned another page. These vegetables. Most could have been used in soups or donated before service ended. The operations director leaned back thoughtfully. We've never categorized waste that way. Maybe we should, Diane replied. Gloria smiled. I told you she sees kitchens differently. Ben folded his hands. What would you call a program like that? Diane looked down at the bread box sitting on a nearby counter. Someone had placed it there after morning baking. Still warm, still fragrant. She remembered hugging a nearly identical box behind the dumpster only 2 nights earlier. Then she smiled. Second table. Ben repeated the words softly. Second table. She nodded. The first table serves customers. The second table serves the community. Silence filled the room. No one spoke because no one wanted to interrupt the idea. The operations director was the first to break the silence. That is actually a very good name. Ben smiled. I think so too. Within hours, conversations began across the restaurant. Not announcements, conversations. Which foods could legally and safely be redirected? How quickly could they be packaged? Which local food banks accepted prepared meals? Who would inspect quality? For the first time in years, employees weren't discussing quarterly sales. They were discussing purpose. 3 days later, Diane completed the final morning of her evaluation. She had expected another practical cooking test. Instead, Gloria handed her a sealed envelope. What's this? Open it. Diane carefully unfolded the letter. Her eyes moved slowly across the page, then stopped. She read it again to make sure she hadn't misunderstood. Whitmore Kitchens. Position offered training kitchen supervisor. She looked up immediately. There must be a mistake. There isn't, Gloria answered. I only came here for a 3-day evaluation. You completed it. But this isn't an entry-level position. Ben, who had quietly entered moments earlier, smiled. No. It isn't. Diane held the paper carefully. I don't understand. Ben walked over to the whiteboard where her workflow sketch still remained. You came here believing we were evaluating whether you could work in our kitchen. He shook his head gently. The truth is, we discovered our kitchen needed you. Emotion flickered across Diane's face. I've never supervised anyone. You already have. She looked confused. When the morning Tyler dropped the eggs, you organized the response. You never raised your voice. You solved the problem, Ben continued. When the parsley shipment failed, you led adaptation. When Gloria challenged your ideas, you listened. When Curtis questioned you, you stayed respectful, he smiled. Leadership isn't a title. It's behavior repeated consistently. Diane lowered her eyes. I don't know what to say. You don't have to. He extended his hand. Just tell me whether you'd like the job. For a long moment, Diane couldn't answer. She thought about Caleb eating tomato rice because bread had become too expensive. She thought about the blue envelope marked home. She thought about Marcus's recipe notebook, Most of all, she thought about the back alley behind the restaurant. 48 hours earlier, she had stood there believing the best outcome possible would be taking home a discarded loaf of bread. Now someone was asking her to help reshape an entire kitchen. Slowly, tears gathered in her eyes. Not dramatic tears, quiet ones. The kind that appeared only after carrying too much for too long. She wiped them away before they could fall. "I'll accept." Then she smiled. "But only if I earn everyone's respect." Gloria laughed softly. "You already started." At that moment, Tyler knocked gently on the open door. "Chef." He froze when he realized the meeting was still happening. "I'm sorry." Gloria waved him inside. "What is it?" He looked at Diane. "The staff meal packages?" "What about them?" "We made 12 today." He smiled proudly. "The community shelter called. They asked if we could send 20 tomorrow." Diane looked toward Ben. He smiled back. "Looks like second table just served its first guests." Diane glanced once more at the bread box resting quietly on the counter. 2 nights ago, it had represented survival. Today, it represented something much larger. Not leftover food, a second chance, for ingredients, for kitchens, and for people. The first month of the second table program began with cautious optimism rather than celebration. No press releases were issued, no cameras arrived. Ben Whitmore insisted on one rule before anything else. "If this becomes a publicity campaign before it becomes a reliable system," he told the leadership team, "we've already failed." So the work happened quietly. Every afternoon, cooks separated food into 3 categories: unsafe, reusable in the kitchen, safe to donate. The distinction seemed simple on paper, but Diane Carter knew it required discipline, judgment, and trust. Every container received a label with the preparation time, ingredients, storage temperature, and expiration window. Nothing left the kitchen unless it met the same safety standards expected for paying guests. Some employees complained during the first week. "It takes longer. It creates more paperwork. We're already busy." Diane never argued. Instead, she joined every station herself. She labeled containers beside the prep cooks. She packed meals beside the dishwashers. She stayed after her own shift ended to help load insulated carriers into volunteer vans. People noticed, not because she asked them to, because she never expected anyone to do work she wasn't willing to do herself. One evening, Tyler approached her while they sealed containers of roasted chicken and vegetables. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Weren't you angry?" Diane looked up. "About what?" "Everything. The interviews. The jobs. The dumpster. The way Mr. Malone treated you." She considered the question carefully. "I was hurt. That's different." "How?" "Hurt tells you something matters. Anger decides what matters next." Tyler thought about those words while placing another lid on a food container. "So, you never wanted revenge?" Diane smiled. "If revenge had been my goal," she looked around this kitchen, "I wouldn't have had enough energy left to build anything." Those words spread through the staff faster than she realized. Within days, someone had written them on the employee inspiration board near the locker room. "Build something, not revenge." No one signed the quote. Everyone knew who had said it. One Friday afternoon, Ben asked Diane to join him on the roof terrace above the restaurant. The city stretched in every direction beneath the autumn sky. Traffic hummed below. For a few minutes, they stood without speaking. Finally, Ben broke the silence. "My mother would have liked you." Diane smiled gently. "I wish I could have met her." "So do I." He rested his hands on the railing. "She died before this company became successful." "I'm sorry." "She never saw any of this." He gestured toward the restaurants, office buildings, and skyline surrounding them. "When I was your son's age, we lived above a laundromat. The ceiling leaked. The heating failed almost every winter. Some nights dinner was whatever the neighborhood bakery couldn't sell. Diane listened quietly. Ben rarely spoke about himself. One baker, he continued, always wrapped the bread in clean paper. He never handed it to my mother in the back alley. He invited her through the front door. Diane looked toward him. Why? So she'd walk out with the same dignity as every paying customer. His voice softened. I didn't understand that as a child. I thought he was simply being kind. Ben paused. He was protecting her pride? The memory settled between them. After a moment, he laughed quietly. You know something strange? What? I spent 30 years building restaurants. And somehow, he shook his head. I forgot the lesson that inspired them. Diane answered almost immediately. I don't think you forgot. He looked at her. I think you got busy. The answer surprised him. You don't believe success changed me? It probably did. But success changes everyone. The question is whether we're willing to notice. Ben smiled. You always choose the gentlest explanation. Not always. When don't you? When people use power to humiliate someone. She remembered the loading dock, Curtis shouting, employees watching. No one deserves that. Ben nodded slowly. I agree. As if summoned by the conversation itself, footsteps echoed behind them. It was Gloria. I hate interrupting sentimental moments, she teased, but you should probably see this. She handed Ben a folder. Inside were reports from the first 4 weeks of Second Table. Meals donated won 184. Food waste reduced 38%. Operating costs slightly lower than the previous month. Ben looked up in surprise. We actually saved money. Gloria nodded. Less waste. Better organization. Fewer emergency orders. She pointed toward another page. And employee turnover dropped. Already. People say the kitchen feels different. Diane looked through the report more carefully. One handwritten note had been attached to the final page. It wasn't from management. It was from a local shelter director. Thank you. Last Tuesday, one little girl asked if someone's grandmother made the vegetable soup because it tasted like home. Several people cried after reading that sentence. Not because of the compliment, because none of them had cooked specifically for that child. They had simply cooked carefully. Care had traveled farther than they ever expected. A week later, Ben invited Diane to a small storage room beneath the restaurant. Dust floated through narrow beams of afternoon sunlight. Shelves held old menus, framed photographs and equipment from the company's earliest days. From a cardboard box, Ben carefully removed something wrapped in faded brown paper. He unfolded it slowly. Inside lay an old wooden breadboard. The edges were scarred from decades of use. My mother's. Diane ran her fingertips lightly across the worn surface. It must have seen thousands of loaves. It did, Ben smiled. She used to say every loaf deserved one more chance. He looked directly at Diane. I always thought she meant stale bread. What do you think now? Ben glanced toward the busy kitchen beyond the doorway. I think she was talking about people. For several moments, neither of them spoke. The old breadboard rested quietly between them, marked by years of honest work. It reminded Diane of Marcus's recipe notebook. Objects survived. But what truly mattered was the wisdom passed from one pair of hands to another. She carefully wrapped the breadboard again and returned it to Ben. You should hang this somewhere. I was thinking the same thing. Where? She smiled. Near the kitchen. So everyone remembers why they came here. Ben nodded thoughtfully. I have an even better idea. He looked toward the training center where new employees gathered every Monday morning. I think every person who joins this company should hear its story. And I think, he smiled warmly, you're the one who should tell it. The first orientation class Diane Carter led consisted of only 12 people. They gathered in the training kitchen on a rainy Monday morning, each wearing a brand-new Whitmore Kitchens chef's jacket that still carried the crisp folds from its packaging. Some were experienced cooks. Others had never worked in a professional kitchen before. One young man had recently left the military. A middle-aged woman had spent 20 years caring for her elderly parents. Another trainee had immigrated to the United States only 8 months earlier and spoke English with careful determination. Diane looked at each face before saying a single word. She didn't begin with company policies. She didn't begin with recipes. Instead, she walked to a wooden shelf beside the whiteboard. Resting there was the old breadboard Ben's mother had used for decades. Beside it sat a simple cardboard bread box, the same style of box Diane had once carried out of a dumpster. She gently placed one hand on the bread box. Most people think this program is about reducing food waste. She smiled softly. It isn't. The trainees exchanged curious glances. It's about refusing to waste people. The room fell completely silent. She told them the story of a woman who had once believed her future had ended after losing her husband. She never used her own name. She never mentioned the dumpster. She simply described someone who had forgotten how valuable her own skills still were until another person chose to look more carefully. When she finished, several trainees looked thoughtful. One quietly wiped away a tear. Before dismissing the class, Diane wrote a sentence across the whiteboard. Respect every ingredient. Respect every person. That's the first recipe you'll learn here, she said. It never changes. Word spread quickly through the company. Employees from other Whitmore Kitchens locations began asking to observe the Chicago training program. Managers requested copies of Diane's food recovery procedures. Within 3 months, Second Table expanded into 6 additional restaurants. Then 12. Then 21. Every new location followed the same principle. Nothing unsafe would ever be donated. Nothing safe would ever be wasted without first asking whether it could serve another purpose. The numbers continued improving. Thousands of pounds of edible food were redirected each month. Operating costs decreased. Employee satisfaction surveys reached the highest levels the company had recorded in nearly a decade. Yet the statistic Ben cared about most appeared in a different report. Applications for kitchen jobs had nearly doubled. When asked why they wanted to work for Whitmore Kitchens, many applicants gave the same answer. It feels like a place that respects people. Ben read those words twice. He quietly folded the report and placed it inside his desk drawer. No marketing campaign could have purchased that kind of reputation. One Thursday afternoon, Diane visited a neighborhood community center where the first cooking class for single mothers was about to begin. The classroom held 8 workstations. Simple cutting boards, basic knives, affordable ingredients. Nothing expensive, everything practical. The women entering the room carried different stories but similar expressions. Some had recently escaped abusive relationships. Some had lost jobs. Others were simply trying to rebuild after difficult years. Many apologized before introducing themselves. I'm probably not very good at cooking. I've never worked in a kitchen. I don't know if I belong here. Diane recognized those voices, not because they sounded identical, because she had once spoken to herself the same way. She smiled warmly. Today isn't about becoming chefs. It's about remembering you're capable of learning. The atmosphere relaxed immediately. Instead of demonstrating complicated techniques, Diane taught vegetable soup. The same recipe could change depending on what ingredients were available. She explained how to build flavor from scraps that most households threw away, how to stretch a meal without sacrificing nutrition, how to respect food without fearing it. By the end of class, laughter filled the room. One mother tasted her soup and laughed. My kids might actually eat this. They probably will, Diane replied. And if they ask for seconds, she smiled, that's your first promotion. The room erupted into laughter. That evening, Caleb waited patiently near the apartment window until Diane returned home. The moment she unlocked the door, he ran toward her. I have something to show you. He proudly handed her a folded sheet of construction paper. Inside was a drawing from school. The assignment had been titled, My Hero. The picture showed Diane wearing a chef's jacket. Behind her stood a restaurant with warm yellow windows. In front of the building, several families carried boxes of food while smiling. Above the drawing, Caleb had written in careful handwriting, My mom doesn't just cook dinner. She helps people believe tomorrow will be better. Diane blinked several times before speaking. When did you make this? Today. Did your teacher help? No. I thought of it myself. She knelt and wrapped him in a long hug. You know, Caleb whispered, I don't worry as much anymore. She pulled back gently. What do you mean? You smile before you leave for work now. The words caught her completely off guard. Children noticed changes adults often overlooked. She kissed his forehead. I think you're right. Later that night, after Caleb had fallen asleep, Diane opened Marcus's recipe notebook once again. The familiar pages still smelled faintly of flour and old paper. She found the note he had written years before. One warm loaf can make a hard day feel smaller. This time she smiled instead of crying. She reached for a pen and carefully wrote one new sentence beneath his. One shared loaf can make someone else's future bigger. She closed the notebook just as her phone vibrated. A message from Ben appeared. Thought you'd like to know? Second table served its 10-0-0-0 meal tonight. Diane stared at the screen for several seconds. Then she replied with only 3 words. We're just beginning. Across the city, Ben read her message and smiled. He believed her, because the greatest thing growing inside Whitmore Kitchens was no longer a restaurant company. It was a culture where dignity had become as important as the food itself. And Diane Carter, the woman who had once searched quietly behind a dumpster for a warm loaf of bread, was now teaching hundreds of people that the most valuable ingredient in any kitchen had never been found in a recipe. It had always been the person standing beside you. Nearly 1 year after Diane Carter first stood behind a dumpster, holding a warm bread box, the ballroom of the Chicago Civic Leadership Center buzzed with quiet conversation. Business owners, nonprofit directors, culinary educators, city officials, and journalists had gathered for the annual Community Impact Awards. Crystal chandeliers reflected soft, golden light across dozens of round tables, but Diane's attention remained fixed on the small note card resting in her hands. It contained only 3 words. Speak the truth. Ben Whitmore had slipped it into her hand before the ceremony began. You don't need a speech, he had whispered. You have a story. Diane smiled nervously. I've spoken to kitchen staff. I've taught classes. I've never stood in front of 500 people. Ben chuckled. They're just people? Gloria, standing beside them, added with a grin. Pretend you're explaining soup. The 3 of them laughed, and the tension eased just enough. When the Master of Ceremonies announced the Community Innovation Award, the room erupted into applause. This year's recipient transformed not only how food is managed, but how people are seen. A large screen behind the stage displayed photographs from the second table program, volunteers loading insulated meal carriers, families receiving dinners, young culinary students learning knife skills, restaurant employees laughing together while packaging meals. Then came a photograph no one except Ben and Gloria had seen before. A simple cardboard bread box sitting on a stainless steel counter. No explanation, no caption, just the image. Diane's heart skipped. Ben had included it without telling her. She slowly walked onto the stage as applause continued. The award itself was beautiful. Clear glass, etched with the city's skyline, but she barely noticed it. She placed it gently on the podium. For several moments, she simply looked across the audience. Some expected statistics, others expected a polished corporate presentation. Instead, Diane began quietly. "A year ago," she paused. "I was embarrassed." The room became completely still. "I thought the worst thing that had happened to me was losing my job." She shook her head gently. "I was wrong. The worst thing was believing my value had disappeared with it." No one reached for a phone. No one whispered. Every eye remained fixed on the stage. "I spent years thinking survival meant asking for less. Less space. Less attention. Less hope." She smiled softly. "Then one evening someone invited me through a back door." Another brief pause. "They didn't rescue me. They respected me." The audience listened without interruption. Diane continued, "I've been asked many times what second table really is. It isn't about leftovers. It isn't even about food." She rested one hand lightly on the podium. "It's about refusing to decide someone's future based on the hardest moment of their life." Near the front row, Gloria quietly wiped away a tear. She had heard Diane speak dozens of times. This felt different. Diane wasn't teaching. She was remembering. "I wasn't standing behind that restaurant because I lacked dignity. I was standing there because life had become heavier than I could carry alone." Her voice remained steady. "And someone chose not to measure me by my circumstances." The audience rose into spontaneous applause before she had even finished. She waited patiently until the room became quiet again. "If you leave tonight, remembering only one sentence." She smiled warmly. "Remember this. Opportunity lasts longer than sympathy." The applause that followed lasted nearly a full minute. After the ceremony ended, dozens of guests approached Diane. Some thanked her. Others shared personal stories they had never spoken aloud before. A retired teacher admitted she had once relied on food assistance after her husband became ill. A firefighter described growing up in a shelter. A successful attorney quietly confessed that his mother had skipped meals so he could attend college. Again and again, Diane noticed the same pattern. People weren't ashamed of where they had started. They were grateful someone had once believed they could keep going. Meanwhile, near the entrance hall, several reporters gathered around Ben. "Mr. Whitmore," one asked, "how much has Second Table increased your company's public image?" Ben smiled politely. "I don't know." Another reporter tried a different angle. "What financial return has the program generated?" Ben glanced across the room toward Diane, who was kneeling to speak with a little girl whose family had benefited from the meal program. Then he answered, "You're asking the wrong question." The reporters waited. "The real question isn't what the program gave our company. It's what the people in our company became because of it." The following Monday morning, life inside Whitmore Kitchens continued almost exactly as before. Breakfast orders arrived. Bread baked before sunrise. Knives chopped vegetables in familiar rhythms. Diane preferred it that way. Meaningful work she believed happened on ordinary days. As she entered the training kitchen, she noticed something new mounted beside the doorway. It was the old wooden breadboard that had belonged to Ben's mother. Below it hung a small brass plaque. "Food carries dignity before it carries flavor." Beside the breadboard rested the simple cardboard bread box, the same style of box that had once represented desperation. Now every new employee stopped to read the story before beginning orientation. Tyler approached Diane carrying another group of trainees' name badges. "They've been asking about the bread box." "What did you tell them?" He smiled. "I told them it reminds us never to mistake someone's situation for their potential." Diane laughed softly. "That's better than anything I would have said." As the newest class entered the room, she welcomed them with the same calm smile she had worn for months. No one there knew that the woman greeting them had once searched behind a restaurant for tomorrow's lunch. To them, she was simply Chef Diane, a respected leader, a patient teacher, exactly the kind of person they hoped to become. Diane looked briefly at the bread box before beginning another orientation. For the first time in years, it no longer reminded her of hunger. It reminded her that every ending someone fears may simply be the place where another person decides to open a door instead. Chicago welcomed the first snowfall of December with quiet determination. By 9:30 p.m., the dinner rush at Whitmore Kitchens had finally ended. The last guests stepped out into the cold, and the familiar rhythm of closing duties filled the restaurant once again. Knives were sharpened, counters were sanitized, and tomorrow's bread dough rested beneath clean linen cloths. Diane Carter removed her chef's jacket and folded it carefully over one arm. She could have gone home. Caleb was probably finishing his homework waiting for her the way he always did. Instead, she followed the same habit she had developed since the second table program began. Every night before leaving, she walked through the receiving area behind the restaurant, not to inspect employees, to inspect the purpose. She checked labels on the meals prepared for the community shelter. She made sure refrigerators were sealed properly. She thanked the night crew before heading toward the parking lot. As she pushed open the heavy back door, freezing air rushed inside. Snowflakes drifted beneath the loading dock lights. For a moment, Diane simply stood there. The alley looked almost exactly as it had 1 year earlier. The dumpsters, the brick wall, the security light humming overhead, even the faint smell of fresh bread floating from the bakery vents. Time had changed everything, yet somehow nothing. Then she noticed movement. Near the last disposal container stood a young woman wearing a thin gray coat that was clearly not warm enough for the weather. She looked no older than 26. One little girl, perhaps 4 years old, stood beside her holding a faded, stuffed rabbit. The woman kept glancing toward the restaurant door before cautiously lifting the dumpster lid. Diane's heart tightened. She recognized the hesitation immediately, not because she had seen it, because she had once carried it herself. She did not call out. She did not rush toward them. Instead, she quietly watched. The woman carefully removed one sealed container from the food recovery bin. Then, just as Diane had done a year before, she checked the expiration label beneath the loading dock light. She placed one damaged package back. She kept only the safe one. The little girl tugged gently at her mother's sleeve. "Mommy, I'm almost done." "I'm sorry." The apology was so quiet, Diane almost missed it. The young mother wasn't apologizing to anyone standing nearby. She was apologizing to her daughter. Diane closed her eyes for one brief second. Then she walked forward slowly. The woman heard footsteps and immediately stiffened. "I'm sorry," she said before Diane had spoken a word. "We weren't making a mess." "We'll leave." Her free hand instinctively reached for the little girl's shoulder. Protecting, just as Diane had once protected Caleb. Diane smiled gently. "It's okay." The woman looked confused. "I know this is private property. I know I shouldn't be here. I just—" Her voice broke. "My daughter hasn't eaten since lunch." Diane glanced toward the child. The little girl smiled shyly, despite everything, still holding the worn, stuffed rabbit. Diane remembered another child, another night, another empty bread box waiting at home. She took one slow breath. Then she said the words that had changed her own life forever. "Ma'am?" The young woman looked up. "Would you come inside instead?" Silence. The woman's eyes widened. She stared at Diane, unsure whether she had heard correctly. "I don't have any money." "I know. I can't pay." "I'm not asking you to." The little girl looked between the two women. "Mommy, can we go?" Tears gathered in the young mother's eyes. She nodded cautiously. Diane held the back door open. Warm light spilled across the snowy pavement exactly as it had 1 year before. Inside, several employees looked up in surprise as Diane entered with the mother and child. No one asked questions. Not anymore. Tyler smiled immediately. "I'll warm the soup." Gloria, now preparing to leave herself, quietly removed her coat again. "I'll slice fresh bread." No one had been instructed. No one needed to be. This had become who they were. A few minutes later, the little girl sat at a small kitchen table, eating tomato soup with both hands wrapped around the warm bowl. She smiled after the first spoonful. "This tastes like hugs." The entire kitchen laughed softly. Her mother covered her face for a moment, embarrassed. "I'm so sorry." Diane gently reached across the table. "There's nothing to apologize for." After dinner, they talked. The woman's name was Jasmine Reed. She had recently escaped an abusive relationship and was living in her car while searching for work. She had cooked for her grandmother growing up. "I always wanted to work in a bakery," she admitted quietly. Diane smiled. "Can you be here tomorrow morning at 7? Jasmine blinked. "For what?" "For an interview." She looked overwhelmed. "I don't even have a resume." "We can fix that. I've been out of work for almost 2 years. We'll talk about that." Her voice trembled. "Why are you doing this?" Diane glanced toward the old cardboard bread box displayed near the entrance to the training kitchen. Then she smiled. "Because someone once opened a door for me." The next morning, as sunlight filled the kitchen windows, Caleb arrived before school carrying a science project he wanted his mother to see. He noticed Jasmine sweeping the hallway while her daughter colored quietly at one of the tables. "Who's that?" Diane placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Someone who's getting another chance." Caleb smiled. "Like us." Diane looked at her son with quiet pride. "Exactly like us." Before leaving for school, Caleb walked over to the little girl. Without saying much, he placed one of the paper stars he had made at home into her hands. "My mom says everyone should have something to look up at." The little girl smiled, as though someone had handed her the moon. Diane watched the exchange from across the kitchen. The circle had finally become complete. It hadn't ended with a billionaire helping a struggling mother. It had ended with a child who had once known hunger and uncertainty, naturally passing hope to another child. Marcus's recipe notebook still rested in Diane's apartment. Ben's mother's breadboard still hung beside the training kitchen. The cardboard bread box still reminded every new employee that dignity mattered before anything else. But Diane had come to understand that none of those objects carried the real legacy. The legacy lived in people, in every meal prepared with care, in every opportunity offered without judgment, in every hand extended before someone asked for help. And every evening, as another warm loaf of bread emerged from the ovens at Whitmore Kitchens, someone always smiled at the simple reminder that had become the heart of the entire company. Every loaf deserves one more chance. So do people. Life has a quiet way of testing how we see other people. It's easy to judge someone by a single moment, a tired face, worn-out clothes, or a desperate decision made on a difficult night. But the hardest day of a person's life is rarely the whole story. Sometimes behind exhaustion is extraordinary discipline. Behind silence is remarkable strength. Behind what looks like failure is a talent waiting for one opportunity to be seen. Diane's journey reminds us that compassion is most powerful when it preserves another person's dignity. Ben didn't change her life simply by giving her food. He changed it because he chose to see her skills before her struggles. In return, Diane didn't keep that kindness for herself. She passed it forward until it reached people she would never have met otherwise. That is how real change grows, not through grand gestures, but through ordinary people refusing to look away. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to hear from you. Have you ever been given a second chance or offered one to someone else? Share your experience in the comments because your story may encourage someone who needs hope today. If you enjoyed this journey, please like the video, share it with someone you care about, and subscribe for more stories about courage, kindness, and the quiet moments that change lives forever.